Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Adrian Amos from Synergy Technical, and I'm going to be joined today by Michael Serra from Arctic Wolf. And we're going to be looking at ways that we can manage our cyber risk and our exposure. I want to thank Michael for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate you being a part of this call.
Yeah, appreciate it, Adrian.
Yeah.
I'm a sales engineer here at Arctic Wolf. We talk daily to different types of customers experiencing certain cyber risks in their environments, and so it's really great to be part of this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know we've been working with you guys for a couple of years now and have done some great partnerships, and it's really excited to kind of push that forward and use this opportunity to regroup and talk about how the risk landscape has changed and kind of look at where things are today. So again, really appreciate you joining us, and again, really appreciate you guys taking your time out of your lunch hour to come and join us. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into content. So it's 2024. Shockingly, we are still dealing with very similar attacks to what we've been dealing with for the last decade and or longer. The top 2024 cyber attacks are a very familiar looking list of things that we've been addressing for a long time. Malware, there are a lot of different types of malware. Number one on that list is still, after all these years, it is still ransomware. And you can see, according to SANS.org, they tracked a 73% increase in the amount of ransomware attacks that were happening over the last year. So this is from a report dated in January of this year. So that's kind of where we're going to be focusing a little bit of our efforts today. But, it's the same stuff, right? It's DOS attacks, it's phishing, it's spoofing, it's identity, code injection, all this kind of stuff that we've been dealing with for the last several years. The landscape, while it has gotten worse, it hasn't significantly changed in terms of the actual threat vectors. What's been interesting, though, is to correlate those vectors against what Forbes and Gartner are identifying as the top cybersecurity challenges for this year. And actually, there's a lot of overlap between these two lists, right? Forbes may break it down into 10, Gartner may break it down into 6, but there's really a lot of correlation between these things. What they've identified is, okay, sure, generative AI, but I promise that's going to be the only time I'm going to mention it in this entire call. Mike, I don't know about you, but I feel like that's a conversation for another scenario. But AI, sure, part of it. Cybersecurity outcome-driven metrics. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on the terminology on the Gartner side, just because, well, there's 5 of 6 of them there listed as overlaps. But what I think that's really important for is us to realize that we have done a great job in the IT space of communicating to the IT team, right? Talking to engineers, to managers, and all that kind of fun stuff. But there's still a gap when trying to take those conversations to the boardroom. Boardroom wants metrics, right? And so we need to have a way to identify metrics that we can use to drive success and identify and recognize success in security. And that's been a challenge, but I think it's getting better. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. The other element that I think is really impressive here is that both are talking about resilience, cyber resilience as a concept beyond simply cybersecurity, right? In cybersecurity, we may talk about tools, but in cyber resilience, we're looking at having a bigger foundation, a bigger footprint, a bigger thing upon which to fall if things go wrong, right? And Gartner is actually explicitly identifying this as resource efficient third-party cybersecurity risk management. And they're also taking that into the next step too, which is a relatively new concept in cybersecurity risk management, is this concept of continuous threat exposure management. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that over the next few minutes, and that's kind of how we're going to lead into the partnership conversation between us and Arctic Wolf. But I think it's really important to understand at a very high level, we now have a framework by which we can build our security management programs, and that framework is going to give us the metrics that are necessary to communicate those outcomes to the boardroom. And I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to solve a big challenge for CISOs specifically, because so far a lot of that has been sort of building the plane as you fly it, right? So really excited. So digging back into the issues that have been occurring, right? Microsoft annually releases their digital defense report. And last year, I said I wouldn't mention it again. Last year's report was almost exclusively focused on leveraging AI. So actually go back to the 2022 report. And I presented this slide at an event at the RVA Sec event conference last year as part of my discussion about evolving landscape of how users are managed and how identity is managed. But really what this was a look at in events where Microsoft was called in to assist with a breach, to assist with some sort of cybersecurity challenge. These were the issues that they found most commonly. And what I think is really interesting for this conversation is that even in 2022, we had gotten pretty decent about recognizing the need for immutable backups, even in a cloud-focused world where we're not just talking about like a backup tape, right? We're talking about backups that the bad guys can't get into and then simply encrypt and ransom. We also had started to get pretty decent about recognizing the importance for endpoint detection and response, and also for SIEM and SOAR solutions. There's still a lot of opportunities around recognizing the importance of zero trust, right? We've been saying zero trust for years, but it's still something that we find even not in the middle of a risk environment or a risk scenario has a lot of opportunity left for organizations to fully expand and explore. And what I think is really interesting here too is if you look at the bottom half of this list, there is so much around authentication. There are so many opportunities to recognize the continuing risk challenges that are presented by authentication. And there's more to authentication than just how are the users logging in. There's also things like what are they logging in to, right? And we'll get into that in just a minute. But what I think is really interesting, pulling all of that back together, looking at the risks that are there, along with what Gartner and Forbes are identifying, is that if we talk about cyber resilience as, again, something that's a little bit beyond just like talking about our specific tools, we need to have a program in place that recognizes how do we do these things with the best and least amount of effort. And if we do those things, if we focus on multi-factor authentication, zero trust principles, modern anti-malware, right? Staying up to date and making sure we have data protections, really just the list on the side. We have 98% of coverage against attacks just with basic security hygiene. But while we're talking about security hygiene, we also have an evolving landscape of compliance regulation, right? And this is a slide I actually produced for an event way back in 2018. And this was, the last line on the slide here was 2018. We can see how much compliance was exploding then. And 2 years ago, I think it was, we actually did a webinar talking about the introduction of state privacy laws that were coming to the US. At the time, there were only 6 of them on board. Congress is literally this week right now discussing whether or not they want to create a federal privacy standard. And it's fun to think about what really caused this whole discussion, right? It was all premeditated, basically, the explosion of it on when Steve Jobs got up on stage and demonstrated an iPhone, right? So compliance really became an issue when we lost a lot of control over the devices, where they were being used and what they were being used to access. And it's never going to slow down. It's just going to keep on exploding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Compliance frameworks are massive. And I was going to spend some time today talking about Microsoft Compliance Manager, but we do already have a video out about that. And if I can get my sides right, I'm going to try to make sure that that's referenced somewhere up here in the in the YouTube video that goes up tomorrow. But in order to have all of this stuff under some sense of control, right? We need to have we need to have a framework by which we can build out our security programs and understand what is our real risk landscape and how does it change over time. And I've been noodling on how best to present this content for about 1.5 years, and then I stumbled across Gartner actually released a research paper on this in the middle of last year. And I've been hearing CISOs talking more and more about how they're organizing their threat landscape and how they're trying to get out of the process of firefighting, of recognizing a 0 day, throwing tons of resources at whether or not that's going to impact them, and moving into more of a holistic viewpoint of what is our risk and how do we manage it. And that's where this concept of continuous threat exposure management comes in, right? CTEM for short, but you're going to start hearing it a lot if you haven't already heard it. We're hearing about it as requests from customers. We're hearing about about it out at conferences. We're hearing about it everywhere. And so we're starting to really look at what does that mean for customers and how do we get people moving into that managed threat and exposure mindset, right? So what it really means is we're identifying a scope. We're scoping out what is our footprint, right? What do we have? What do we know about? What do we not know about? Because the scariest thing I ever heard somebody say from a CISO perspective was, don't tell me about that, because if I know about it, I'm responsible for protecting it. And we just can't operate like that, right? So we have to have a scope to understand what is our exposure. We have to have an ongoing discovery process to onboard new resources, whether they're devices or IoT or their network or their applications, or increasingly, whether they're disconnected elements that still represent part of our security landscape. Mandiant tragically got taken down through their social media credentials a few weeks ago, and they got defaced publicly, right? So that's not something that would typically be on a CISO's radar for something to manage and be aware of, but these are part of our attack surface, and we have to be aware of it. We have to have a mechanism for discovering it and bringing those under our control. We then have to be able to prioritize our threats. Not just say, oh my goodness, there's something new happening and I got to throw my resources at it, but like recognizing what the priority of a threat is to the systems that we have in place, and then validating that threat. Say, is this really a challenge based on the mitigations that we have in place? And then what do we need to do to further protect ourselves from this challenge, both as it exists today and as it may evolve in the future, and as it may evolve with the assets and applications that we intend to deploy. So this continuing ongoing concept of understanding what do we have presented externally, what are our risks, how are they really transferring into actual threat for our environment, and what do we do about it? And so what's been really neat is that Microsoft actually at Secure last month introduced a whole management interface for this into the Defender dashboard. Currently, there is no charge for this. It's just there. It leverages the tools that are already in place, and it is actually an evolution of SecureScore. You may notice over here under exposure management that SecureScore has moved from being a top-level blade of its own to being a component of this exposure management element. And so what we're doing is we're tackling all of those first three components of that wheel, scoping our threats and exposures with an attack surface map, discovering assets and risk with an ability to recognize and define criticality and also programmatically assign criticality based on attributes of objects in our environment, and then to prioritize threats with the threat analytics dashboard. And this is what allows you to say, okay, there's this new 0 day, right? But do I need to worry about it? Well, we can actually see how we are exposed for those 0 days, which is super cool, rather than chasing a whole lot of effort. Those exposures are then aligned to key initiatives, and these initiatives can be tracked as a group. They can be tracked separately. We can actually define ranges for where we want to be on them, but we can also then use the tools that are built into this to define how we are meeting these things, and again, deliver those metrics back to our board. And if we dig into any one of these things, you'll notice one of the first ones that I actually really like is this critical asset protection, right? So we've defined asset criticality, whether it's going to be based on devices being exposed to the internet, or maybe it's a tier 0 device like a domain controller, or even a tier 0 device like a privileged access workstation, based on the fact that somebody's logging into it with a privileged role. We can recognize all of those things, define the criticality, and actually deliver these metrics and drive toward these metrics and push that information back to the board so that we can verify that we are doing what they expect of us. And while there's a critical asset protection one that I love, there are 13 total. Another one is ransomware protection, right? And this, again, it's really just looking at what SecureScore says are things that we should do, taking those SecureScore recommendations, grouping them into individual metrics, and serving them up to us so that we can understand how best to drive toward these protections across our environment. And again, like I said, it's all based on SecureScore. These are literally actual SecureScore recommendations that are just surfaced up into this view. And again, so we're talking about CTEM as this 5-point wheel, right? That has the scoping, the discovery, the prioritization, and then we need to talk about how we're actually going to protect these things. And that's where we actually have a lot of opportunity to branch off into different directions. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about what Arctic Wolf brings.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks, Adrian. I think that's such an important discussion about how are we, focusing on this posture management and the specifics to my organization, because that's what is, as we're finding, is what's changing in these landscapes for all different organizations. They have a certain level of risk tolerance that they need to address and add the right processes around, and different attack surfaces. I want to kind of bring that back to just the risk itself, how we're quantifying that. These are some of the metrics we're seeing in the industry. Talk through how we can address that from an operational standpoint to put in some of these practices you're mentioning, Adrian, and other ways of thinking about doing that if that's something that your team isn't able to do. And lastly, while these are more broad industry statistics we're looking at, talk through maybe how do I quantify that more specifically for my organization. And so bringing that back of why Adrian is talking about these types of strategies and just showing some of the numbers that we're seeing today, looking at the IBM breach report in 2023, other statistics that we're seeing out in the industry. We saw that the average data breach cost for an organization was $4.45 million. And so these are real numbers that you should be aware of and understand how maybe that applies to your organization specifically, especially as you're either using that for drivers on how to add a certain level of layer into your security and bring awareness to that. On top of that, the surrounding metrics I think are important to understand of why having the right operations in place is really important. On the left here, you'll see the dwell time of a bad actor adversary inside of my environment is on average 206 days before an organization is able to identify. And that's what leads to the evolution of how an adversary was able to infiltrate your network to determine business processes or get to that level of ransomware attack where it leads to this level of breach impact. The time of attack, right? When is that happening? Is that often, from our data, we're seeing 40% of these attacks are occurring during that nighttime, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Time frame where people are sleeping. Do you have the right operations during these times to help protect your environment and set up in the forefront to reduce that likelihood in the first place? And talking to that likelihood, bringing back to the picture of what Adrian was talking before, is what is my risk of the different portions of the exposures of my attack surface. These are some of the statistics we're seeing in the industries of the annual likelihood of certain types of attacks, and how they begin. Business email compromise, as Adrian showed, there is one of the number one attack vectors, like accessing your SaaS components, right? Because of the expanded perimeter that we've seen, the ability to log into this outside of your specific networks. We see the other statistics here is of data breach being at 15% or 9% in an organization. So that's overall risk landscape, things to consider in terms of what is that risk really, and it's about understanding the likelihood of a risk occurring in your environment and the overall impact that can occur if that happens. And so that's really when we're talking about mitigating that and our approach to that, where we at Arctic Wolf want to help, talk to that picture of addressing that total risk landscape. When we're talking about mitigating that risk and putting in these good principles that Adrian is mentioning, there's a lot of key components in the technology side of things, right? Having the right perimeter defenses, MFA tools set up, firewalls, zero trust type activities, that are in place. But the other portion that is often a gap and a common gap for the industry that we see is the operations side of it, having the right talent, dedication, and focus and process to getting to the certain outcomes around having that continuous process to always be assessing, what are the common exposure gaps out there, having a good monitoring process in place on a 24/7 basis. We see that most teams of small IT sizes are struggling with this because they aren't able to apply the right dedicated focus. And so there's other solutions out there for you to consider, right? Especially if you're seeing some of those metrics that you feel, hey, I'm susceptible to these, right? How can I add more operations into my business? There are solutions such as Arctic Wolf where we can provide another layer of that operational focus. On top of that, one last important thing to note here is there is no silver bullet to 100% securing your network to all operations, right? Adrian even mentioned that you can get up to that 98% level, right? What is that 2 to 5%? How do I address that in terms of wanting to make sure I can address the total risk to my environment? And that's where we looked for things like risk transfer aspects. So cyber insurance, other solutions that can offer additional financial assistance on top of these services they provide, which is an option that we provide at Arctic Wolf, right? We provide a warranty to our business that if something happens under our watch, we're able to provide some financial assistance towards that. So the next slide here I want to talk to is, this concept of, having the right operations in place is not, a synergy thing. It's not a Arctic Wolf thing. We're seeing the standards of Gartner, being put out there of how do we approach these, and what we're seeing from the industry standard frameworks and the compliance, right? As you look to the different controls that you see in these factors, this operational aspect is really important, right? A lot of it is beyond just tools. It's having the right processes in place to do things like assess risk, have a good incident response process, understand that. NIST just came out with their 2.0 cybersecurity framework, and what they added was that center circle around governing, because what would happen in often organizations is they go through that initial assessment, they get the right practices in place, but they didn't have a metric around making sure that we're continuously updating this and changing this procedures over time rather than just maybe a more annual basis, right? And that emphasizes this focus that Adrian is talking about of things are constantly changing. How do I make sure that my processes remain up to date and take into account my operational focuses? So what does that really look like, right? We have the risks that are involved. We have these compliance factors that say, here's some of the elements that we need to put in place. Why is that important? What does it look like when a real attack happens in my organization? And so I have a couple examples of attacks that we've seen and how having the right response practices in place can show you how you can stop that in a really quick matter of time. If you want to go ahead and build this all the way out there, Xavier, that'd be great. And I could talk through this. So the first one I want to talk to is that 20% likelihood we started with, right? A business email compromise attack, what that can lead to. I just talked to a banking organization recently that they had an affiliate that they worked with where this was the attack that they saw, right? Someone had compromised an account, intercepted communications, and understood how they did things like their banking wire transfers. And just at the right time, after sitting this environment, as we see is very common with this, is they wait to respond, create that fake link that all of a sudden they're able to intercept and say, hey, that $1 million transfer, actually send it to this link instead, right? They knew when it was going to happen, the way that they asked for it, the way that the links looked, and they were able to infiltrate that communication. And these attacks are often set up and look like what you'll see here as I walk through this example. So the attack that we saw in our organization that was monitoring our system it started in the middle of the day where we saw a bad actor had stolen credentials, had logged into an account. Now, initially, this looked like the normal user logging in because what happened in this situation is the real user allowed them in past their MFA push, right? A mistake was made, but now this is something that becomes really hard to detect from if you don't have the right processes in place of, is this the real user or an adversary? And so having the right detection strategies in place and focusing on these key elements of exposure risks for your environment is really important. And that's where in our security operations center, Arctic Wolf, we key in and clue into these really intricate details of what's happening. What are common malicious behaviors? And so 20 minutes later, nothing has happened yet, but the bad actor starts to set up their attack. And that's where we see them make this first move of hiding themselves from that real user. Just within that story I just mentioned of, they set up a inbox forward and delete rule to hide themselves. And now they can start doing communications to things like a best practices training that has a lot of different users within this organization's environment. Well, that is something that we have source detections on with our integrations to things like Office 365, the components of activities happening inside of security events. These are common malicious behaviors we look for and have rule sets against. We have a triage team that's ready to respond when we see something like this, which is really important for having that operational process to take into account, hey, we see this initial indicator happening. Let's make sense and determine what is the action need to be taken in the situation. Is this really something that is real or is this a false positive? And by having that readiness and availability of a team that's monitoring 24/7, we're able to bring in that human context on top of the tools that are provided. And so we'll see in real time the bad actor making their next play, which solidifies what is happening to the response team. And so at 122, the next step comes into play where a PDF is uploaded, right? Likely with malicious content and now we can see what was happening, having all the details together and correlated. The bad actor logged in, stole credentials, filtered themselves out, and now they're uploading a phishing PDF. This looks like some sort of internal phishing campaign that could lead to more compromised accounts, access to additional information based on the accounts that are being compromised or certain levels of controls. We need to get on this right away. And so that is what we're able to, in this timeline, within 9 minutes of the organization, right? This is something that has gotten past your preventative tools, requires this response process and focus. We're able to say, hey, let's get this bad actor out of this account, reset these credentials because we see this activity happening. And so that's just something to keep in mind of how quickly these things can happen, how important it is to respond, because if we don't intercept this PDF from coming in, it leads to the bad actor gaining further access. The resiliency side is the last part here where we follow up, right? Why did this happen? How can we do to verify that this won't happen again? Doing things like clicking on that PDF, making sure that no one actually accessed it, understanding, if we can pull that into our own sandbox environment to see what could have happened, right? That's the other follow-up resiliency aspects that we have as part of that full process that is something to consider when you're thinking about your own operations. On top of the tools you have, do you have the focus and dedication into these types of investigations? One more quick example, I won't go in the same level of detail, but just to show another angle, right? We talked about a business email compromise attack. The next would be a ransomware activity, right? This was another attack that we saw where we saw ransomware activity and the type of system we have in place, as Adrian was pointing at, more investigation needs to go into things like SIM and SOAR capabilities. Well, what you'll see here is we saw activity that got past, again, a preventative tool. It got past antivirus, but with a malicious activity that was presented to our team had been tied to known indicators of compromise of a bad actor group are evil. And so what we saw from our additional detections and having our centralized platform with the intelligence of known malicious groups out there, we're able to really quickly unravel what is happening. The indicator that comes into us from the endpoint was that had gotten past an AV was a admin password script being changed. That triggers this investigation just a couple minutes later to present to our investigation team. And what the information they're presented with based on the centralized system that we have in place is, hey, this looks very eerily similar to this known attack we've seen in the wild by REvil, which is a ransomware group known for certain types of attacks where it starts with what we call search engine optimization poisoning. A bad link is clicked that drops a Java package, initiates this admin password script, and the next probable payload is a ransomware. Command and control traffic, initiating and shutting down all servers across the environment. With this context in mind, we're able to very quickly move, right? This requires some level of operations of, I've detected this, it's gotten past my automations, how do I respond to this? And so that's where our team is able to kick in with that context very quickly. Within 3 minutes of us beginning this investigation, actually issue a containment to that endpoint to prevent that spread and a lockout of your entire environment that can lead to these very damaging impacts that we saw in those initial statistics. So that's going to be, that process of having that SOC team and the right tools in place to actually monitor and correlate all that together is really important. The last thing I want to highlight is that resiliency aspect. Whether you're doing this ahead of an attack based on intelligence you have, because of the good risk exposure management processes you put in place, right? We may prioritize ahead of time going through some sort of ransomware hardening exercise, or if this is something that has come up more recently, we need to now maybe shift our focus there. And by having the right expertise and that can provide you this type of information, we are able to provide our customer with that security journey aspect, right? The resiliency piece. Why did this happen, right? We know the story of how that attack progressed. So we're able to help them with making better configurations to their environments, doing things like enforcing stricter egress traffic controls or browser control settings, or just enough administration tactics within their PowerShell environment to prevent the ability for an adversary to create this kind of access. So those were just two examples of why you need that operations in place. I want to next step to the proactive side of things, right? It's part of it is responding to reduce that impact. How do we address reducing that likelihood in the first place? Again, this is really what Adrian was talking about at the beginning with, looking at this exposure management, having it on a continuous process. This is our strategy that we leverage from our vulnerability management aspects of doing continuous scans of our environments that we help implement for our customers as well. Because in the past, we've seen people go through different types of assessments, whether that's penetration testing or risk assessments or doing the vulnerability scans that may be tactically tied to a more quarterly or annual type review. And the problem with that is a lot of things are changing in that time frame. You are making business adjustments. You're maybe making migrations to things like moving to the cloud or other adjustments that are being added to your environment. Well, in that time that you do this initial assessment, work through prioritizing through a big list of information, and tactically are starting to work through those and maybe work through the criticals. Now we're working through the less critical information. Before you go to that next assessment, there are new risks that are coming out and being built upon that you're not even looking at or providing the right focus to. And so what happens is it creates this new spike of risks that have grown for your environment that have not been addressed, and it creates this vicious cycle of a big stack of lists, reprioritization, addressing them, and what's happening is you're maybe not drawing your focus to the right aspects. And so with our continuous model, whether that's just for general posture improvement around taking different configuration aspects, helping provide your prioritization focuses, as well as these more holistic scanning activities, what we help our customers with is we'll do that initial scan, help with that initial assessment to bring down to the correct baseline. But from there, we're doing this continuous motion of understanding what is the real-time snapshot of the real vulnerabilities that exist for your organization. And now this becomes a much more tactical, and sustainable process around just managing ebbs and flows of new vulnerabilities that have come out, that is prepared and planned upon. So it's a lot more actionable, and less stress around, this big waves of different risks. So another aspect of your operations to consider today, when we're talking about these risks, is how am I managing that? How am I defending against, putting the right response practices, and how am I proactively looking ahead to reduce that likelihood in the first place? The last slide I'll leave you with here is bringing that back to that risk discussion, right? We showed the statistics at the beginning of the call that apply to all organizations. What do I need to consider for my organization? Here's a slide that goes over the common known facts of what happens in an incident, right? What are the costs associated with that? People might be more familiar with things like forensics or incident response, legal counsel, restoration and recovery, but oftentimes they don't realize what else can be added into this that drives that number way up to that 4 million number that we saw. That seemed maybe a little bit astronomical for my organization specifically, such as things like ransomware payment, lawsuits, revenue downtime, wasted payroll, other components that will come into this, as you're seeing here. And what we're seeing is insurance typically ends at some point around what they'll really cover, and not all of these different factors are taken into account initially. And so that's something to then consider as we're looking to drive, to the right level of risk assessment for your environment, the right operations, is to consider these factors. We have a tool here at Arctic Wolf. I know Adrian and the Synergy team have a numerous ways to help assess your risk for your specific environment. The last, kind of call to action I wanted to leave here today was, if you want to jump to the last slide here, Xavier, is we have a calculating the cost of a breach tool that we can provide to your organization, where you're able to use your specific industry, look at your specific revenues, the number of employees you have, that can help output some of these ransomware costs or business costs, data costs based on these industry standards that we see, and help dive into, what are some of these underlying costs around forensics and how they come up, again, to help justify that business case for, hey, we might need to put a little bit more action towards this. So that's all I had today in terms of how we help reduce that likelihood, that impact, and bring some awareness to that. So I'll drop that link to Xavier to share out to with the Synergy team of if you want to take that first step and maybe addressing and seeing in a new lens of what those risks might cost. But really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. I really the stats are amazing, right? The numbers, the time to breach, we've heard it range anywhere from it started at 200 days years ago, it got down for a brief period. It looks like it soared back up again. But I think what was really fascinating for me was how quickly the Arctic Wolf triage teams were able to respond, not just to an investigation like being triggered, but to actually making a meaningful change. It's staggering to think that you can actually start to contain something in like 2 or 3 minutes, right? And like it's very easy for me as an organization or in a security organization to think, oh, I could do that personally, but like that's oftentimes as much time as it takes me to walk back to my desk after I get the alert on my phone that makes me go, uh-oh, right? Yep. And you guys are already on it and actually closing the ticket. I think that's fantastic speed to recovery. I'm really super awesome. So as you mentioned, Synergy does also offer some means of getting an organization started with security, and we do partner with Arctic Wolf. One of the things that we do, though, as a no cost introduction to our security knowledge and understanding, is we offer a security CIE, and these are typically I've done probably a couple hundred of them over the last 6 or 7 years. But these are a highly interactive, no cost, 90-minute to 2-hour immersion experience where you and a few people on your team can come and explore the Microsoft security tool sets in a demo environment. I don't have any third-party security solutions in that particular environment. It's pretty small and isolated, but it is driven by both real world scenarios that are emerging today and also in a very consultative approach with the people who are on the call to address the specific challenges that they may be seeing or may be worried about emerging in the environment. And they typically actually start with what we started with earlier with the exposure management because it's shiny and new, but we'll go a lot deeper and dig in a lot more to the rest of the tool set. The other thing that we offer to get started is a security assessment engagement where we actually roll up our sleeves and dig in your real environment, right? And we look at what is deployed today, what tools are in use both to secure, protect, and understand the ongoing landscape of your risk, and then to identify gaps and help come up with an actionable roadmap that can go anywhere from 6 to 12 to 24 months out. And we've done a ton of those as well. And again, I'm super excited about our partnership with Arctic Wolf. And that's really all I've got for you today. So I really want to thank you for your time and for taking some time out of your lunch. And we're ending a few minutes early, so hopefully you'll be able to enjoy a nice, quiet few minutes to round it out. But again, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Mike, for being a part of our call today. Thank you for the amazing partnership over the last couple of years, and enjoy the rest of your day.